The winter of 1897 crept into Jade Creek Valley with the quiet determination of a bill collector who never forgot a name. It arrived without warning or haste, spreading thin sheets of frost across the windows of the scattered cabins that clung to the eastern ridge. Ice clung to the naked branches of the cottonwoods, turning them into glass sculptures that held the pale sun as though even light had frozen in the air. Snow drifted downward in a patient, muffled veil, blanketing the ground in a white so unbroken it made the world feel newly made and strangely hollow. Millen stood before her small kitchen window, watching her breath gather in faint clouds against the glass. Behind her, the cast-iron stove pulsed with the faint warmth of two logs she already regretted using. Half the woodpile was gone, and the other half needed to last until the thaw that the almanac insisted would not come until late March. Every evening she calculated the same grim arithmetic, counting logs the way she once counted flour scoops for the bread Thomas loved. The kind, he said, reminded him of his boyhood home in Pennsylvania. He had been gone 18 months now, taken by the influenza that swept through the valley and stole 17 souls, including the Pritchard twins and old Samuel Worth, who had survived bullets and bayonets only to fall to a fever no one saw coming. Millen had endured that first winter on the careful savings Thomas left behind, the small hoard of coins tucked in a tin box beneath loose floorboards. But the second year told a harsher truth. The summer's crops shriveled in a drought that left the soil cracked like a broken dish. What little she could tend alone had failed, one wilted stalk at a time. Her few hens stopped laying as early as November, and she had sold them to the Websters for far less than they were worth, because everyone knew she needed the money, and pity often disguised itself as bargaining in a place like Jade Creek Valley. Now, on December 23rd, the cupboard held only 2 cans of beans, a dwindling sack of cornmeal, and a jar of preserves she had been saving as though it were gold. Christmas dinner would be thin cornbread and the last of the beans. No ham, no sweet potatoes, no pie cooling on the windowsill like the years when Thomas teased her for cutting the crusts too thick. Millen turned from the window to the empty kitchen table, its surface smooth from years of meals and talk, the grain visible where the varnish had worn away. She had scrubbed it yesterday out of habit, the motions automatic, as though cleaning could fill the silence that pressed against her ribs. Even the clock in the parlor ticked, as if indifferent to her presence, marking seconds that felt heavy enough to bend the air around them. Outside, the sky turned the color of cold iron as the light thinned and snow began falling once more. Smaller flakes this time, drifting sideways in the wind. Millen pulled her shawl tight, reached for another log to feed the stove, then hesitated. Not yet. She could bear the chill a little longer. She had grown used to making discomfort stretch. It was at that moment that 3 firm knocks sounded against the front door, each one cutting clean through the quiet. Millen froze, her hand still resting on the chair. No one had approached her home in weeks, not since Mrs. Patterson visited with her basket of apples and that expression all married women wore when speaking to a widow, part sympathy, part relief that her misfortune was not their own. The knocking came again, more insistent. Millen stepped carefully down the narrow hall, her footsteps echoing across the bare floorboards. Through the frosted glass pane of the front door, she saw the silhouette of a tall man, shoulders squared, outlined by the last blush of twilight. When she opened the door only a crack, a rush of cold air pushed in. Standing there was Ben Garrett, her nearest neighbor, though nearest in Jade Creek meant a mile and a half across stubborn fields, and a creek that froze only on its own schedule. She had seen him only in passing since Thomas's funeral, a distant figure on horseback or a man bent over his chores, his solitude as solid as the land he worked. "Millen," he said, lowering his hat, snowflakes clinging to his coat like scattered ash. His voice carried a roughness that sounded carved from riverstone. She kept one hand on the door, wary by instinct. Women who lived alone learned caution from the air itself. Ben cleared his throat and shifted his gaze slightly to the right of her shoulder, as though speaking directly to her required effort. "I'm heading into town at first light," he said. "Roads are worsening. Thought I'd ask if you needed anything brought back." The offer hovered between them, fragile and heavy at once. Something tightened in Millen's chest, an ache shaped like pride, fear, and weariness all at once. "That's kind of you," she answered carefully, "but I'm managing." Ben nodded slowly, turning his hat in his hands once, twice, the way a man does when searching for the right words and finding none that fit. "Right then," he murmured. "Offer still stands." He stepped back as though preparing to leave, but Millen surprised herself by speaking again, her voice pulling free without her permission. "Mr. Garrett." "Why?" It was a simple question, yet heavy with meanings she couldn't name. He hesitated, the wind whispering through the bare trees behind him. When he finally spoke, his words were softened by memory. "My wife died 3 winters ago. Child too." His eyes lifted to hers, revealing a grief she recognized instantly because she carried its twin. Millen stood in the doorway, the cold biting at her ankles, while Ben's confession seemed to settle into the dim hallway like falling ash. She had not known about his wife, nor the child who never saw spring. The valley hid its sorrows well, each homestead wrapped in its own veil of silence. "I don't need charity," she managed, the words smaller than she intended. "No," he agreed, voice steady, "but even the strongest folks sometimes need someone nearby." For a moment their eyes held, two griefs recognizing each other across a space neither had ever invited company into. He placed his hat back on his head, nodded once, and stepped off the porch. His footsteps crunched across the snow until the darkness swallowed him completely. Only then did Millen close the door, leaning her forehead against the chilled wood. Something had shifted inside her, not hope exactly, but a faint crack in the frost that had settled around her heart since Thomas's death. That night she lay beneath quilts that held more memories than warmth, listening to the winds scrape at the eaves. Each creak in the walls sounded like bones settling, and sleep drifted away each time she reached for it. She thought about Ben's stark honesty, the quiet sorrow in his face, and the unexpected feeling of being seen rather than pitied. By dawn, the sky was a muted grey, the kind that seemed undecided about offering light at all. Millen rose early, feeding the stove with 2 of her remaining logs. She brewed the last of her coffee grounds, thin and weak, and stood by the window watching the winter morning sharpen into form. Christmas Eve. In years past, she would already be baking, humming softly as she prepared goose and sweet potatoes, Thomas bringing in evergreen branches to hang over the doorframes. Now the house smelled only of cold air and weak coffee. She measured cornmeal for the simple meal she intended to stretch through Christmas when she heard the sound of wagon wheels crunching through hardened snow. She stiffened, hands pausing over the bowl. Ben's wagon appeared through the drifting flakes, pulled steadily by his roan horse. He climbed down with the careful steadiness of a man who had learned long ago not to trust icy ground. Before he could knock, Millen opened the door. "Morning," he said, carrying a wooden crate in both arms. Snow clung to his lashes, melting slowly in the heat that drifted from inside. "Stopped through town earlier, picked up a few things, thought you might use them." His tone was simple, matter-of-fact, giving her an easy path to refuse if she wished. But the crate was full. She could see flour, canned goods, something wrapped in butcher paper, and her breath caught. "I can't pay you for this," she said softly. "Not for a while." Ben shook his head before she finished. "Not asking for payment. Call it settling an old kindness." He shifted the crate so she could take it. "You visited my Sarah years back when she was feeling poorly. Brought her tea. Sat with her when I had to head to town." Millen blinked, memory stirring. She remembered that visit, though she hadn't known how sick Sarah truly was, nor that her time was already running short. "It wasn't much," she murmured. "It was something to her," he replied. "And to me." He hesitated only long enough to see if she would step aside. When she did, he carried the crate to the kitchen table, setting it down without ceremony or expectation. "There's a small ham in there," he said, nodding at the wrapped package. "Some potatoes, a tin of coffee, a bit of sugar, odds and ends." The abundance was overwhelming compared to the barren shelves behind her. She felt her eyes sting, her throat tighten. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, though she already sensed the answer. Ben turned his hat in his hands, that familiar gesture of his. "Because I know what it's like," he said. "To think asking for help means you've failed. To live so deep inside grief that the world looks smaller than it is." He paused at the doorway before stepping out. "I've got a goose roasting for supper," he added, voice low. "Too much for one man. If you wanted to bring some of that ham over, we could share a meal. Seems wasteful for us to sit alone in warm houses pretending we're fine." The invitation was gentle, practical on the surface, but Millen heard the truth beneath it, an offer of connection disguised as simple sense. "What time?" she asked before doubt could pull the words back. "6," he said. "Gives you time to prepare." After he left, Millen stood staring at the crate as though it might vanish. When she finally unpacked it, the tears came, quiet, unstoppable. She cried for the kindness she hadn't expected, for the grief she had carried alone, for the small reminder that another human being still saw her, still believed she was worth reaching toward. When her tears quieted, she lit the stove again, this time without counting logs, and set water to boil for the ham. The scent of cloves rising in the kitchen felt like a memory returned from a distant world. She peeled the potatoes, baked small biscuits, polished apples until they shone. For the first time in months, her hands worked with purpose that wasn't just survival. Tonight she would not eat alone. As the short winter afternoon thinned into evening, Millen dressed with deliberate care. She chose the grey wool dress she had worn to Thomas's funeral, the nicest garment she still owned, though it carried the weight of that terrible day. The fabric had faded in places, the stitching softened by years of wear, yet as she smoothed it over her frame, she felt a quiet steadiness settle into her. She brushed out her hair, pinned it with trembling hands, and stood before the small mirror above the washstand. The woman reflected back appeared older than she remembered, shaped by hardship and months of silence. But there was also something different in her eyes, something awake. At 5 o'clock she gathered the ham, biscuits and carefully polished apples into a basket. Wrapping herself in her heaviest shawl, she stepped out into the cold. The wind stung her cheeks immediately, yet the cold no longer felt like an enemy. It simply reminded her that she was alive enough to notice it. The path curved past the creek, its surface half frozen and whispering beneath thin sheets of ice. Beyond it stood the grove of cottonwoods, tall, silent, their frosted branches arching overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. Millen walked through those woods slowly, the basket heavy on her arm, her breath rising in small puffs that dissolved into the blue-purple dusk. It had been years since she'd made this walk, not since the early days when Thomas introduced her to the Garrett family. Time lost its sharp edges in rural places, blurring into seasons, harvests, droughts, and losses. The snow beneath her boots packed down with soft crunches, and more than once she paused to shift the basket's weight, feeling warmth return to her fingers only in brief waves. The first stars began to pierce the sky, tiny, crystalline, cold as the world around her. As she walked, she found herself thinking of thresholds. Some were literal, doorways she had crossed on the days that changed her life. Others were invisible, quietly reshaping everything even when she did not notice their passing, leaving her parents' home to marry Thomas, entering the house he had built for them, walking behind his coffin to the cemetery. Each one had marked an ending and a beginning. And now, tonight, she sensed another kind of threshold under her feet, not a grand transformation, but a small shift in direction, a crack in the ice, a step out of her fortress of solitude, a recognition that grief did not require the world to shrink around her forever. The trees opened into a wide stretch of snow-covered land, and Ben's home came into view, a low wooden structure with smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Warm, golden light glowed from the windows, casting soft rectangles onto the snow. The sight made Millen's breath catch. It had been a long time since she approached a house that wasn't her own, a long time since she walked toward warmth instead of guarding it. Doubt crept in, sharp and unwelcome. What if she had misunderstood his invitation? What if this was simple, neighborly obligation, a gesture he would regret? She slowed her steps, gripping the basket tightly, but the smell of roasting goose drifted through the cold air, rich and comforting, mingling with the scent of potatoes and bread. The aromas tugged at memories she had buried, holiday dinners, laughter, the clatter of plates, the bright hum of company that once made winter feel less cruel. She swallowed hard, struggling with the fear of stepping into something she no longer knew how to navigate, but even as uncertainty pressed against her ribs, she kept walking. Her feet knew the path even if her heart hesitated. By the time she reached the porch steps, the sky had deepened into a velvet blue scattered with stars. She paused, steadying her breath, feeling the cold seep through her boots. For a long moment, she stood perfectly still, listening to the quiet, an expansive silence that could feel either lonely or peaceful depending on the weight one brought to it. Before she could reconsider, before nerves could root her in place, she raised her hand and knocked lightly on the door. It opened almost instantly, as though Ben had been standing close by, waiting. Warm light spilled out behind him, gilding the edges of his broad shoulders. When he saw her, the stern line of his face softened, not quite a smile, but something warmer, gentler. Not relief exactly, but an easing, as though her arrival had answered a question he had been asking himself all day. "Millen," he said quietly, stepping aside to make room for her. His voice held a warmth the winter could not touch. "Come in. You're right on time." She stepped over the threshold, the heat from the hearth washing over her, and for the first time in 18 months, she felt the world expand rather than close in. Warmth wrapped around Millen the moment she stepped inside, the kind that seeped into her bones after months of living with a chill that no number of quilts could soften. The room glowed with firelight and lamplight, casting gentle shadows across the wooden walls. A pot simmered on the stove, filling the air with the rich aroma of roasting goose. Ben closed the door behind her, careful not to startle. "Let me take your basket," he said, reaching out with hands that seemed far gentler than their roughness suggested. She allowed it, watching him unpack the ham, biscuits and polished apples with quiet appreciation. He placed everything on the table with a sort of humble gratitude, as though her contributions mattered more than their size. "You didn't have to bring all this," he murmured. "I wanted to," Millen replied, though the words felt strange on her tongue, giving instead of enduring. The silence that followed wasn't heavy like the quiet in her own home. It settled softly between them, warm and familiar, as though the house itself welcomed the company. She found herself relaxing in small increments, shedding layers of tension she hadn't realized she carried. Ben moved about the kitchen with a slow, practiced ease, checking the goose, stirring the pot, setting 2 plates on the table. Millen stood nearby, unsure whether to help or simply observe, until he handed her a worn towel and nodded toward the biscuits. "Set them out? They smell too fine to stay wrapped." She obliged, carefully arranging them on a plate while the fire popped behind her. "You must have cooked for a full household before," he said, not looking up from the carving board. She hesitated, then nodded. "Thomas liked big meals, said a full table made winter feel smaller." Ben's knife paused mid-slice. "Good man, your husband." The words were simple, spoken without pity, and for the first time since Thomas's death, the mention of his name did not tear something inside her. Instead, it felt like a small recognition, a gentle acknowledgement that grief and remembrance could sit at the same table without wounding her. When Ben resumed carving, the steady motion soothed the hollow places in her chest. It struck her then how long it had been since she had shared a kitchen with another living soul, how deeply loneliness had rooted itself into her daily rhythms. They sat together once the meal was ready. Goose, potatoes, the ham she had brought, biscuits warm from the cloth. It was far more food than either of them could eat alone, but together it felt perfectly measured. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply ate, the quiet filled with the crackle of the fire and the faint whistle of wind against the window panes. When Ben finally spoke, his voice was low. "I used to hate nights like this," he said. "Winter made the house louder somehow. Every board creaked different after Sarah passed." Millen nodded, understanding all too well. "I kept thinking I'd grow used to the quiet," she said. "But I didn't. Instead, it settled deeper." He looked up at her then, not with sympathy but with understanding, real, unguarded, shared. Something shifted between them, subtle as the shifting embers in the hearth. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. A knowing that 2 people could sit in the hollow places of grief and still find warmth. She felt herself breathe more easily, as though the tight grip around her ribs had eased for the first time in months. The food tasted richer for it. When the meal ended, Ben poured them each a cup of coffee, strong and fragrant, a stark contrast to the thin brew she'd been rationing for weeks. They sat near the fire, hands wrapped around warm mugs, shadows dancing across the room. For a long time, neither spoke, and yet the silence felt full, no longer a void, but a space shared between them. Finally, Ben said, No one should have to carry the weight alone. Not always. Millen stared into her cup, the warmth rising against her cheeks. I don't know how to start again, she admitted in a whisper. Ben nodded, as though he had heard those same words inside his own heart many times. Maybe we don't start, he said. Maybe we just take one step, then another. Outside, the wind softened, and snow drifted in gentle flurries past the window. Inside, the fire burned steady. When Millen rose to leave later that night, Ben walked her to the door. She stepped out into the cold and looked back to find him watching her with a quiet steadiness that felt like something fragile and new. "Good night, Millen," he said. "You're welcome here any time." And as she walked home beneath a sky full of winter stars, the valley felt just a little less empty than it had the night before.